What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Twink Revolution. I'm Sam.
And I'm Gian.
And we're back with two returning guests, Esperanza Fonseca, as part of the group Affirm, and then Mila Ghorayeb of Unacceptable Podcast. Did I get your names right? I'm so bad at it.
Good. That's a good start.
Cool.
First Twink Revolution episode to ever pass the Bechdel test. Hopefully, we'll see.
Yeah, I don't know, man.
So first off, let's talk about men. Sorry, I have to. What have we got, Sam?
So
why have we gathered these fine ladies?
So we brought you here to women-splain women's liberation and feminism because we're gays and we don't talk to women besides anyone else. So, well, welcome, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, thanks.
So, I guess to kind of start us off easy, what's a term like women's liberation, right? Means so much, but within the context of you both being Marxists, there's obviously intersections of feminism, and there are versions of feminism that are explicitly Marxist, perhaps, and versions that are not. What does this sort of mean to you, and is it important to identify as a feminist if you are a Marxist? Anyone who wants to take that first?
Yeah, who wants to go first? I mean, I have like how I had a story before about my transition from libertarianism to Marxism. I feel like my feminist journey was just as chaotic because I started really enthusiastically into it, and it was actually my door into Marxism in a lot of ways. But like very recently, I was feeling very disillusioned with feminism because I think, the mainstream of it is just being a foot soldier for neoliberalism and imperialism. And so I read this book called Philosophical Trends in the Feminist Movement by Anuradha Gandhi. And it was like if there's any feminist text I recommend, it's probably that, if you want to read about Marxist feminism. So I think it can be useful to identify with the label feminism, but I also think that what it means today to the mainstream and to the average person is something that I don't want to associate with. But who knows? And maybe I'm gonna feel the same way about Marxism after you showed me that Lululemon ad.
Esperanza, you're part of an explicitly socialist feminist organization, right? I mean, is that an important label to you?
Yeah. So, for me, I say that I am a proletarian feminist. And what I mean by that is the kind of feminism, that really started with Anuradha Gandhi's work, continued through, Hisila Yami and some other really communist women's fronts. And the reason why I use the term proletarian feminism is to separate sort of this type of feminism from, other trends, such as liberal feminism, radical feminism, and even socialist and Marxist feminism. And, the main differences that I would argue are that, one, rather than seeing patriarchy and capitalism as two separate systems that impact our lives, I see capitalism as the main system and patriarchy, which used to be a mode of production, a set of property laws, et cetera. I think that is what we used, how we use the word patriarchy today really denotes a male supremacist culture, but not the kind of mode of production patriarchy that existed prior. And so I think it exists in sort of the superstructure as, a vestige that deforms our economic base. And that's why, you have more men than women in, the upper class, et cetera. And then I think also, while I take a lot of like inspiration and insights from radical feminism, radical feminists see man, woman as the primary contradiction in society. And I would argue that it is a contradiction, but the primary one is between the classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, although the gender contradiction influences the class contradiction.
So, I mean, wow, that's very class reductionist of you. But I
get more complaints.
Yeah. I mean, so I'd love to pull on that a little bit more. So in terms of the kinds of vulgar understandings of feminism that a random person off the street who maybe is not politically aware might associate feminism with various kinds of a kind of like bourgeois or liberal feminism, right? Which is something about inclusion in the ruling class or an equal opportunity or an equal shot. Do you feel like the term still has value, or that you can kind of use it to communicate what you want to communicate?
Yeah, I'm a little bit agnostic about it, because like there are principles of it that I just like I do fundamentally agree with. I mean, I think obviously again, this is going to sound very similar to my libertarian to Marxist story, but I mean, my interest in feminism always came from a concern of gendered violence, and gendered violence, particularly in the context of war as well. And so I've never been really concerned with the sort of representation politics. I've enjoyed some of the radical feminists, just like Catherine McKinnon, Andrea Dworkin. I think they were actually very integral in moving me to Marxism, even though they're not technically Marxists. But I think it's important to specify what you mean by it now, because I think predominant conceptions of it are an issue. And for me, I'll always just be like, look, I take on issues that are feminist issues, like gender violence, and or things like, I worked with a lot of at-risk youth, girls, and trans youth. I didn't work with them, but I was advocating for them. And so I think it's important to recognize that there are issues that are gendered, but like Esperanza was saying, that's not the underlying base. It's capitalism. So I think it's very important for people to kind of explain that in explaining their feminist inclinations, and really distinguish ourselves from, the baddies.
Yeah. I would actually be really interested in like hearing more on, the work you've done on militarism and male violence. Mm-hmm. For me, the word feminism or feminist is still important. My organization, Affirm, was founded by women who were leaders in the Communist Party of the Philippines, the MLM party. And, one of our founders even wrote the biography of, Jose Maria Sison, who's like the sort of ideological leader of that party. But since Affirm, was sort of separated from the party, the reason for that was because, aside from wanting, sort of like more autonomy to do work regarding, women's issues in the US, and not just as a solidarity organization of like the party, is because a lot of times, communist organizations, of course, can be male dominated and don't always put the woman question first, but often put the woman question last. And I think that, at this point in history, if it's not always been true, we can't afford to put the woman question last. While I think we need to overthrow capitalism and the ruling class in order to achieve women's liberation, I don't think that overthrowing the ruling class will necessarily achieve women's liberation. And that's where I think feminism comes in.
Yeah, that's interesting. So like I kind of view, like, I think my issues with some forms of feminism has been the same as my issue with homo nationalism when it comes to war, which there was a great article on Twink Rev about. So good job, guys.
Thank you.
But I like, so my issues have kind of been that, you know, there's been posited like this sort of singular woman identity that's like equivalent, that faces the same kind of struggle globally. But then you look at like perpetrators of, say, imperialism, women are included in that, and the women that are impacted by war, like there's been so much research that shows that women, there's a unique kind of violence that women experience through imperialism. And for me, so my issue has kind of been like, okay, first of all, these people do not have the same interests. They're actually pitted against each other. But I mean, that's also in the same way that, say, the working class in the global south, their interests are pitted against the working class in the global north as well by imperialism, as Lenin has noted. So that's kind of been a concern of mine. And I also think that the struggles that women have are not necessarily the same in every region. I see, like, sort of like, say, sexual discourse on veiling to be one of the most annoying discourses on feminism, because now what's happening is we have all these well-meaning liberals that are like likening veiling to like a choice, like to where it's the same as like wearing makeup, or someone was saying like Billie Eilish's choice to wear baggy clothes. And and I think that, you know, this might be a well-meaning attempt to be like we're all the same, but I think that it actually does benefit us to kind of acknowledge that there are differences in women's struggles, and we can, you know, send solidarity. But they like, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
But this is, I mean, I think this is a really interesting point, and it's a something that probably you know, for women have experienced it for longer, in that the collapsing of class distinctions, national distinctions, whatever hierarchies are doing violence to people. It's always been a party trick you can pull, right? Which is to reduce it to some other identity signifier. For example, you know, gender is an easy one, because it does provide a satisfying explanation for so many of the effects people are seeing. You know, it is you know, to veiling or whatever. You know, it is something that is not applied universally. But once you start saying, yeah, what is the impact of, say, you know, having women drone pilots or something? It's, you know, it's that's what it's rendered ridiculous, and yet it's so easy to kind of do versions of that in this conversation, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And that might be just a symptom of, you know, creating a controlled opposition, or, you know, capitalism's ability to sort of consume everything and make it its own. I mean, Mark Fisher made this point. I think you made this point last night as well, Gian, on Twitter when you were talking.
People were very mad about me not putting footnotes in my late night anodyne tweets.
No, I just say both of you great thinkers.
Well, I was paraphrasing Mark Fisher. I mean, I was shamelessly. I like Mark Fisher. Yeah. It's also paraphrasing Marx, but like, whatevs.
Any reference to Mark Fisher is good. Honestly, I think he's probably my favorite theorist. And you know, it's just, you know, there's this sort of idea that there's even room for anti-capitalism within capitalism, and I think, you know, similarly, there's a room for a kind of feminism, even when there's still gendered oppression and gendered violence, and that form of feminism can even perpetuate it, just as some anti-capitalism actually perpetuates capitalism. And I think capitalism has consumed feminism and made it back in its own image, and so that has kind of made what at least Western feminism has come to be.
Yeah, I think that, you know, also brings up that Lululemon. Is that how you pronounce it? Lululemon?
Yes, unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, so that ad that was like decolonize gender, a workshop on like resisting capitalism. And I mean, you know, just of course it just comes off so absurd, but I think it also like highlights the real problems I have with this idea of resistance and how a lot of the left like fetishizes resistance, like specifically individual acts of resistance. And I think that, you know, you could resist something your whole life, but all that's not going to, you know, add up and amount to a revolutionary transformation of society. And so I think resistance is nothing more than just a sentimental value, that I'm sentimentally in opposition to something bad, but it is not a strategy for actually, you know, overturning that bad thing.
Yeah, if I was, you know, didn't want my country invaded or my person violated, I would simply resist. You know, I would
yeah,
vote.
well, this is funny. Like, it's a bit of an aside, but I was laughing when, like, after Trump got elected, like the Hillary crowd started calling themselves the resistance, because in Lebanon, the resistance, like Hezbollah is referred to as the resistance. And like in the Middle East, they refer to like this sort of like axis of resistance, which is like Hezbollah and Syria, and basically like the so-called anti-imperialist powers. And so it's just kind of funny to me that, you know, sometimes I hear resistance and I'm like, wait, which one are you talking about? Are you talking about like Islamic duty to like kick out Israel? Or are you talking about girl boss Hillary Clinton?
It's Star Trek, surely. You know, resistance is futile. It's truisms.
True.
You know, a lot of our words are just, you know, completely watered down here in the US. Like, I was talking with some comrades in Brazil, and they use the term militant. We use the term activist. And I think that just is another term that's like completely watered down in the US.
Militant or activist?
The way we use activist, you know,
yeah,
versus how they would call an activist a militant.
It almost has like a cringe connotation now.
Right.
Pacifist.
So I want to get a little theoretical and kind of delve into some of like the feminist theory and like what is the Marxist perspective of like what is gender and what does it mean to be a woman from a Marxist perspective, because there's so many different feminist perspectives on what these terms and concepts mean. I mean, there's the postmodernists who claim there's no such thing as gender because nothing's real. Or you have the gender essentialists who like base it in like sex or something like that. So I'm curious, like, what are your takes on this and like what is gender from your Marxist perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think Esperanza will probably have a lot more of an eloquent take than me, because I haven't really looked into gender metaphysics for a while, but I almost have like a Wittgensteinian perspective that's like, you know, this is like I think that like sex and gender like is very hard to reduce them into like a identifiable set of things. So I think it's just like a social category, and social categories are real. And like they can still be socially constructed and real. So I think, you know, that's something that's kind of missed in a lot of the like gender debates among feminists or whatever, especially the ones that talk about, say, like socialization, because I don't think socialization is sufficient to say, okay, this is the gender that you are and whatever. But it's also, I don't think sufficient. You can't sufficiently say it's like a mental state. And so, yeah, I think I would just be somewhere in between there. And I think Esperanza could probably take it from there.
Yeah, I would, you know, say that I too am in like, you know, development of my thoughts on like what is gender and what is sex. I feel like I'm sort of caught in a few different ways of thinking about it right now. One is that, the postmodern idea that, gender is just a mental state or just an identity. Like I could just suddenly wake up one day and say, I'm a woman, I'm a man, I'm this, I'm that. I mean, the dominant line is to say, okay, right, we accept that. And I think that, we do that because trans people in particular have been so, have experienced so much violence when they name who they are that we want to validate and affirm them. And I think there's also like a sort of psychological approach that we take towards trans people, and that's why we're so over affirming. But as a materialist, a historical materialist, I don't think we could just say gender is like a state of mind or just an identity that you just sort of identify as, and it is real because it's in your head. But I also think that, radical feminists can fall into biological essentialism because as a materialist, biology isn't the only thing that has a material reality. Also like society, the economy has a very like material force. So I think, it is biological because you can't deny that women's oppression throughout history since it started was not deeply connected to their biology, reproductive and sexual functions, or that now women's oppression is not womb to tomb, right? It is. But I also think that as trans women, when we sort of transition, we also become, the word benefactor probably isn't the right word, but, initiated into that world where we also experience male violence and oppression as women. And then the last thing is just, I think that like we need to look at it dialectically. And so like for Marx, when he thought of like, the working class and the capitalist class, he saw them in opposition to each other and that, one could not exist without the other. And so I think looking at gender dialectically too, we have to look at, we want to see what is woman, well, what is the woman in relation to a man? Because that is how our, society constructed each category.
It feels like the there's in so many avenues of our lives where there's an attempt to understand or construct strict ontological categories, be it man or woman or be it gay or straight or socialist or like pick one. There sort of usually ends up being like a working definition that everyone kind of just like gets, but probably can't really explain. As in like, yep, I've pattern matched in this way, and I have a good working definition. And then there's sort of like a debate me nerd version of this where you put on your fedora and you just have to then start picking at the edges, right? And figure like, where is exactly is the boundary? It's very important to me. And so, I feel like it's not like, it's not even a question. The deep metaphysics of it do not trouble most people, except usually when they're trying to probably be an asshole or trying to maybe say victimize some trans people locally or like it's sort of, I feel like that's where so much of this starts coming out. And so I do understand therefore why there's maybe a suspicion about the tone of voice in which people might start asking deep metaphysical questions about the nature of gender.
Yeah, and there are also people that just don't think about it at all. Right?
Most people, surely.
Yeah, and sometimes, I mean, I used to admin for like a page, and a lot of the people that were admins for the page were like English third language, and like someone used the term female in a post, and like there was just a swarm of people being like, how dare you say that, and blah blah blah, and like there's a history of that. And I was thinking like, not everyone knows that I don't even really know what the history of why it just sounds weird to me. That's why I don't say it. But like
say what?
Female.
What was that?
Like people have said that it's offensive to say the term female, or there's also like, people are putting an X in woman. And I don't really like, there are people who are just so outside of that debate, and it's so outside their political interests, and like, you know, the like it's in the academy maybe, or it's in like certain social circles. But I really think that a lot of people just don't think about gender ever. They just like, they're like, okay, well, I know what gender roles I have to conform to, and like that's that.
Yeah, you know that that brings up like two thoughts for me. One is that I think there's a really like harmful trend within, you know, the postmodern influence strands of the movement, which is to try and make woman or female out to be sort of like a bad word that you shouldn't say. And I understand, like, you know, in part the impulse for it, like, for example, saying people that menstruate instead of women. But I think, you know, to include trans men. But I think it gets taken to a point where like naming women or, you know, femaleness is seen as oppressive. And I think that is connected to using an X in woman, because people think that you could just change the word and change reality. And I think that's been disproven by history. Like, you know, you look at communities that have reclaimed slurs against them, you know, that has not stopped racism. Racism is still going very strong, you know, but then you look at the other side, you know, like, for example, trying to not reclaim what they consider to be a slur, like the word prostitute, and instead use the word sex worker. But even people who use the word sex worker a lot of times still have stigma, you know, against those women. So I think we need to stop thinking that we could change the word to change reality, and instead just try to change reality itself.
There's a fear of or rather, among those who are well intentioned but maybe ignorant, there's a fear. It feels like a minefield to navigate the what am I allowed to call you? What am I allowed to say? And then that gets conflated very quickly with, I think, exactly that strand you talked about, which is an actual intentional desire to play word games, right? With the belief that might somehow change reality.
Yeah, and I think that kind of comes from like this kind of postmodern stage. Postmodern, neo-Marxism. Not really Marxism, but it kind of, there's a sort of overemphasis of language and the power of language. And I've seen it when reading feminist theory as well. And it initially really spoke to me, and then like I got less overzealous about it. But a lot of this comes from like a lot of feminist theory is really, and gender metaphysics and stuff is influenced by speech act theory by J.L. Austin, which kind of treats speech as not just describing something or commanding something, but actually constitutive of an act. And I think that, you know, a lot of people in this like postmodern era and in various gender studies, feminist studies environment have really taken this seriously. And not just in academia, but in common activist discourse, where we really see words as being more weighty than material conditions. That to me is a really big issue. But it's funny to me because I don't just see it on the left. You also kind of see it on the right as well, when they ascribe so much power to terminology or to readings or to certain things. You know, it's almost like it's a contradiction, because they're complaining about postmodernism, saying everything is language, but then they're also getting upset and ascribing a lot of value to the power of language as well. And it's not that language isn't important, but I think its role is overemphasized.
Yeah, I think a really good example of that is the Ben Shapiro thing, where he won't use like a trans person's preferred pronouns. And I think there was a debate of him and like Blair White, who has cringe politics, but she was like, if you were in a restaurant, you wouldn't say, I'm looking for like a man, you're looking for a woman, because to the whole world, like we would say, yeah, you're a woman. And he's like, yeah, I'd agree with that. And then like goes back to like, well, words have meaning, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, they see it as sacred. It's like same with Jordan Peterson being like, I will not use they pronouns. And it's kind of like, if you really wanted to combat postmodern thought, you would just not care, because you wouldn't ascribe so much weight to that. You would be concerned with people's material circumstances. And so, if a professor thinks that they don't have enough academic freedom, the issue isn't language. The issue is an overbearing administration that's beholden to a bunch of rich donors. So there's always a material explanation, but I think people want to sort of revert to this like POMO, everything is language.
Blair White is just really something else. I mean, she's got, yeah, you all probably agree with me. I don't even need to get into that.
Facts don't care about her feelings.
I don't know as much about her, honestly, but I think she's like pretty, but that's about it.
She is pretty.
I mean, that's what happens when you're wealthy and get to redo your face.
See, there's a material explanation really, for literally everything, even prettiness.
Well, you certainly it's unfortunate she couldn't fix her politics along the way. No. Money cannot buy you better politics.
She just wants attention, right? To be that one trans girl that's like siding with the wrong side, but she's not at all intelligent. Much further than like she just knows how to market herself well. But also a lot of trans YouTubers I completely disagree with. But this brought up just one thing for me, which is that I'm taking this seminar in like metaphysics of gender right now. And of course, as a Marxist, I'm like really struggling with all of it. But one thing I found interesting is that we're talking about like how the concept of person or personhood has always been deeply gendered in Western culture, or really almost everywhere now. And so just how like, for a long time, I've been thinking like, why is this calling trans women men have such like a dehumanizing effect on us? Like a lot of trans women, after they get called men, get killed or attacked, right? And I think like when we see the way that personhood has been wrapped up in gender, it sort of makes sense, even, women was a category to deny, women personhood and, keep them as chattel for a while too.
Well, as Esperanza, I'd love to ask you a little bit about, to see you first. I mean, you've talked about, certainly in the sex trade, the sort of the oppositional nature of people buying sex and people selling it, and the side of struggle being bodies. But I mean, how much do you find in terms of in these discourse things that go on, even zooming out to a wider or broader societal perspective on gender, the kind of the forces of reaction get a lot of air in this, right? The extreme versions being like men's rights advocates or just sexists, like actual out and out misogynists or bigots. And I mean, in terms of how much do you feel like our current conceptions of a notion like womanhood is sort of defined in opposition to whatever all that is? Sorry, that was a slightly winding question.
Yeah, I think they have, because they're reactionary, they have a stake in maintaining traditional gender roles, they're, reactionary, so they want to maintain the basic economic unit of capitalist society, which is the heterosexual nuclear family, and want to heavily police and discipline any deviations from that. And so I think, that's what we have to fight.
Yeah.
I don't know. No. Sorry if that's not a good answer.
No. Thank you for pulling a meaningful answer out of my wandering sort of looping question there. I guess I was sort of thinking in along exactly those lines of the policing of the boundaries, right, can lead to, I think, a tendency to say fuck all the boundaries, right? We are, thinking about like social conservatism in sexual strictures, leading to a kind of a free love, abolish the family type thing. Sorry, I don't know if this is making any sense.
Oh yeah, I think
I'm free associating now. I don't know what's going on here.
Well, I think like that the family thing is something that's Another thing that when I first got into feminism, I was like hesitant to be on, like, because I wanted to really be on board with everything. And then like the anti-family stuff, I was like, oh, because, you know, when you come from like a Lebanese culture, everything is like about the fam, right? It's like you got to be loyal, ride or die for the family, whatever. And I really liked what, like, in Anuradha Gandhi's book, she kind of talks about how this like opposition to the family is a very sort of like American phenomenon. And but even like Black families, for instance, felt alienated by this because during slavery, that was like something like a source of comfort, the family. And so I think, again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before, is how I think a lot of dominant feminist discourse doesn't really properly account for women in all different conditions and circumstances.
Definitely. I think my stance on the family is that my problem with the family is not that a man and a woman fall in love, have children together, and want to spend the rest of their lives with each other and, you know, have close bonds with each other. My problem with the family is that the nuclear family is the like basic economic unit of capitalist society, and that it, you know, has often served as like a site of oppression. And so, like, reading Engels, like, you know, Origin of Private Property, you know, and the State, like families were constructed differently according to the mode of production, you know. So during primitive communism, like the family was more collective. And now the family is so atomized and like individuated, you know. And a lot of our cultures that have such an appreciation for the family, like, for example, where I come, I'm half white and half Mexican, and my Mexican family, like, although it's still atomized, like there is this sort of extended like family culture that we have that still sort of has the remnants of a more collective understanding of family and not sort of atomized nuclear family.
Yeah, I think that's true of like similarly with like Middle Eastern cultures. Like you think of your family as like this large group of people that's scattered across the globe and like, you know, going to, and I'm sure like John, like it's similar with Italians, like
Hey. Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you look at working class families in general, and especially in the US, there's this much broader sense of like family beyond just like biology. It's like your grandmother's taking care of the children because you're working two jobs, or maybe one of the parents is in jail, so the family's helping them. While you see the like the bourgeois feminists be like, well, I don't need a husband. I can just like have my baby myself, and like I don't need this like collective unity because they have material needs met because they're in that small group of people.
Right, it's a mode. It's a mode of the relations to the mode of production for the nuclear family are strained already. I mean, it's sort of it's unclear what purpose it's serving anymore, and so
well,
it shall continue to atomize, right?
Yeah. No, and this is where like socialist feminism or materialist feminism is like has its strength is in explaining how production relates to the family. I mean, I know like I think Dal Costa was it like wrote about how, you know, the nuclear family as it is kind of, because of the workplace, assumes that you have like a wife at home to perform the reproductive labor. So the structure of the workplace is still kind of oriented or like creates the way the families are structured, because you kind of need someone to be at home doing the work while you know, someone is at work. But like there are some theorists that, you know, they don't necessitate that it's women. It's just like there's been a trend in political theory where it's like, okay, one group of people does like the philosophizing and the work, and then the other, but then in order for society to be able to do that, we need one class of people, whether it's like slaves or, you know, wives. Not saying that the gravity of those are the same. And I know someone will misquote me on that, but But I there's always like in political theories, especially from before, like in the history of political thought, there's always this need for like a certain class of people. And sometimes it's like, doesn't specify which kind of class of people it needs to be. It's just like, well, someone's going to have to take the fall and do these tasks so that the rest of us can be free, so that the rest of us can maximize profit, so that the rest of us can be philosopher kings, like just stuff like that. And so, I think that, again, like the materialist conception is, I think, the only kind of feminism that can account for that.
I was going to say, just delving into that more, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the solution to domestic reproductive labor, because there's so many debates within feminist and even like socialist discourse on how do we deal with this. Is this a necessary reality, or do we collectivize it, or do we make it a paid job with like a UBI thing? I'm curious, how do you see us, like, what should Marxists be advocating for to address this mostly unpaid form of labor?
Well, I haven't decided yet. That's why I'm like,
That's okay.
Because I was at first I thought, okay, yeah, maybe waging it makes sense. But I read Angela Davis, Women, Race, and Class, and she talks about like not wait, like she was citing Lenin and talking about how maybe that's not the best thing to do. And I mean, I think changing the way that our economic system functions first needs to happen. But I don't know if Esperanza has like further ideas on that.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat as you and really thinking through where I stand on this. I can sort of identify things that I don't think will work, like the wages for housework, for example. I think that campaign had a historic significance because it called attention to the house as a site of exploitation. The exploited reproductive labor of women. However, I also think that, the campaign has the effect of also just sort of reifying women's position as in the home and in the domestic sphere. And then I also know that, the USSR had tried to collectivize reproductive labor, but it, wasn't necessarily entirely successful in guaranteeing women's liberation. And so I'm more interested in going down that path and like the collectivization of reproductive labor and the valuing of care work. But I do think we need to look more deeply into actually existing socialism and how they handled it.
There's a sort of interesting, I guess, even to discuss this within sort of neoliberal and capitalist societies, there's a tenor to it that can clang, right? Which is to say, well, it's reducing this thing which is special, right, and revered as motherhood, or even just the idea of acts of charity against to others, or service for people you love in your family, all this stuff, and it goes, wow, you're assigning monetary value to that, or it's a transaction, it's so clinical, and I think it's even kind of there's a step before even figuring out what to do is kind of getting people to agree on what the problem is, because I think to so many people they've shrugged their shoulders.
Yeah, I think so. I think, we definitely, I think it's a really economically difficult concept, actually, which is probably why I haven't like properly formulated a view on it, because it's just like, it seems very complex. And again, like, I think different households are going to approach domestic labor very differently. For instance, like, I don't think it's necessarily going to be just, about women being the domestic labor. I mean, in a gay relationship, is it like, what is it? Is it the more feminine person does the...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
in the domestic labor, or like, and so, yeah, I think my difficulty has been in generalizing it or coming up with a generalizable theory that's economically sound. And so, I mean, I've like flirted with the certain ideas, but I've never really thought to, establish to myself, okay, yeah, this is what I believe.
Yeah. Switching topics a little bit. So a hot topic in like the feminists and just the broader political scene in general is kind of the trans discussion, and now the many other gender non-conforming identities that are emerging primarily in, I'd say, younger populations. I'm curious, like, what do you think is making this such a hot button topic in political discourse, especially like feminist and even Marxist discourse? And also, like, what role will these new gender identities play in feminist struggle if more people aren't really falling into the typical like male or female identity?
Okay, do you want to take this first, Esperanza?
Oh, y'all are trying to get me canceled.
You're our local turf. Recall, from the last time people were throwing that one at you.
Yeah, turf, surf, free femme is a new one. Trans medicalist, I don't know, a lot of things. Yeah, so I think one is that, again, I keep going back to this, as materialists, right? We should not see the introduction of, a plethora of non-binary gender identities as a phenomenon separate from the mode of production under which we exist, which is capitalism. That's not to invalidate their genders, but it's just to situate it historically. I think some people would argue non-binary people existed, prior to this, like even prior to colonization. But I would argue that is presentism, where we apply our concepts and understandings in our current time retroactively throughout history. I think they had their own specific gender systems, which need to be understood on their own terms, right? And that's not the same thing as how we understand non-binary identity and gender today. And so in saying that, I do think that capitalism has this way of like proliferating things, and sort of like infinite eternal options. I don't think that's a bad thing. Socialism is like the ultimate realization of freedom. And I would imagine that, it would open up people's expression however they wanted to express themselves. And I think that's a good thing. But I also don't think that we can really understand it outside of like its historical and material origin. And then, the second thing is just that, non-binary people are also a sort of like contestation of like, the gender system that we have, and a relatively new destruction of that system. And I think we still have yet to see how that plays out. But I do think that, it is going to be important to study, because the movement is pushing to redefine gender. And it's going to be interesting to see how successful they are at that.
Yeah. There are definitely some things I would be hesitant to say, just because like I don't want to be yelled at. And then I think like the fact that I'm like hesitant might not be a good sign. But I mean, I would definitely agree with your point where you're talking about how the claim like, okay, yeah, there's always been non-binary people. There's a common claim that I hear a lot, that the gender binary is an invent of colonialism. And I think, I think it's been imposed on some societies via colonialism, like on indigenous societies, or like in India, they have like a sort of third gender, which is also like, they have issues with the third gender, and then like trans people, because the third gender people don't like they don't recognize the other. I'm probably butchering this, but and so yeah, I would resist it, because I also think there are societies that have experienced colonialism, but also had the gender binary prior to that. And I think there's a reason why. And I think I take issue a lot with in this kind of discourse, when people kind of try to make like observational claims, like what you're saying before, like, yes, like maybe it has not always existed. That's like not a statement of value. You're not necessarily saying like, it's good that it hasn't always existed. Or we're not saying, you know, like, I feel like if people, there's a sort of tendency where if somebody says that something is not a certain way, it means that they're saying that it's like bad. So for instance, I kind of saw this a lot with like the born this way discourse where, you know, oh, okay, well, you should accept me if I'm gay because it's not a choice. And my point was like, so what if it's a choice? Like, you should be allowed to choose that. And similarly, like, I don't really have, like, I think that people who care a lot about, you know, how people identify with their gender, to the point where they make a career off of complaining about like pronouns is just like, you might have personal issues that you got to work out, you know? But like, you know, I like, you don't need to be worked up about it. And I think, you know, we can have like a discussion and like, you know, engage in historical or anthropological research and say, okay, when did this start? What were the like social material relations that gave rise to this? And I think, you know, even if it was invented like 2 years ago, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, dress however you want, identify however you want. That doesn't really offend me. I think it's only bad once it's used as like a bludgeon against other people. In this sort of like liberal representational like identity politics kind of way, but that's a totally separate question from like, did this always exist? And I don't know the stats on like the amount of people that are now identifying with non-binary. I get like the urge because it feels like you're constrained. But my sort of materialist conception of this is that even if you identify as non-binary, people are going to perceive you and place you into a category that, you know, you might not personally identify with. It's the same with like, I don't think gender and race are like metaphysically equivalent, but like if you are you know, like if I'm walking down the street, my race isn't always like apparent to people. And similarly, like your internal gender identification might not be apparent to people. So if you're non-binary and you look what is traditionally seen as a woman, you might still experience like being treated as a woman. And I don't think we should shy away from acknowledging that fact. And I also don't think that we should obsess about it and be like, how dare you identify in this way? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. What matters is like how it's being used politically. And it can be used in politically pernicious ways. But it can also just be like totally benign and all good. So
yeah, I think the point of identity manifesting from like the material conditions is something that a lot of people in maybe the feminist or like the LGBT plus community doesn't really want to acknowledge. I remember really early in the podcast when we started, I said that maybe all of the identities manifested because of neoliberalism, like all these new gender identities and sexualities. People got really mad at me.
Yeah,
but
that's risky.
Yeah, so I see. So we stopped talking about the issue on the podcast, but like the gay identity as well manifested in like only a couple like 100 years ago, and like
if that,
yeah,
ontological gayness is pretty new.
But they took it as an insult or an unvalidation of like their identity. So I'm wondering, like, yeah.
Well, I would hasten to add. I mean, we've had people who identify as non-binary on the pod, and people who identify as agender, and I'd say the universal thread I would pull through the people who I know who are non-binary or gender non-conforming in some way is actually a pretty general chill about like understanding. Yes, like there are going to be people who don't A, understand it, or B, make assumptions, get them wrong. And like, that's kind of fine. I think it's there's a very specific kind of online performative. You have just, murdered my entire family in front of my eyes, kind of thing, which is not, I mean, it is very separate from the conception or the origin of, say, non-binary identity, which is, an interesting question. But I think, as you say, Mila, like not one that actually has real moral weight versus, yes, like a very specific online phenomena, which is like not great.
It just seems like a stand-in for like a lot of culture wars.
Yeah.
And like the way that it's articulated is like very, like it's almost so meaningless, because you basically, like in the US political context, for instance, you have like the Republicans who are like making these graphics being like, excuse me, there are only two genders. And then there are like, and you're like, okay, cool. Like it's just a signal to someone else that you're right wing. Like it's not really, like it doesn't have real material weight. It's just kind of like you're just trying to get attention and signal that you're associated with other political opinions. And then at the same time, you have people like Kamala Harris being like, trans rights are human rights. And you're like, okay, but like materially, what did you do? You locked them up and you put trans women in male prisons. So like what people say and the kind of lip service that they pay, I feel like it's more of like a signal to people than it is actually, or like a stand-in or proxy, than it is an actual, like, I don't know, political thing or consequence.
Yeah, I feel like the only thing that's been interesting to me to watch as a development is this sort of like kind of I'm not the world's most masculine man. Is to see kind of a kind of policing of the boundaries of gender, as though there's a sort of a correct way to be male or female, resulting in a manifestation of people saying, well, I kind of reject all of this, which does seem to me to be acknowledging, at least tacitly, the idea that there's sort of a correct way to perform maleness. There's a reinforcement of the binary going on in there. To be not binary means the binary is real. So I wonder if within the bounds of sort of some of the kind of liberatory politics of gender, whether this stuff sort of, is there an inherent conflict there? I don't even know. I mean, yet again, I feel like the actual stakes are pretty low.
Yeah. Well, one thing I think is that, like, and again, I really don't want to like get harassed for saying this or canceled, but like, regardless of what we identify as, like, gender is not just an identity. Like, gender is something that happens to us. It's like a social condition. Some people say gender is like a class. I don't know if I consider it a class, but I mean, it is put on us. Like, in a way, we are gendered, like I say, there was a complete difference for me before I transitioned, when I identified as a trans woman, versus when I actually transitioned and materially became one. And so I think that while we can identify as anything, our oppression is not rooted in our identity, but in our material existence in society. And so one of the things that just sort of frustrates me is when I see people, some people, it's not all people, but some people who do not transition, but then argue that they're sort of oppressed because they identify as trans. And it's not the same thing as, for example, being a transgender woman, one that is transitioned and experiences male violence as a transgender woman. And so I think gender is material. And I mean, that's why we transition, right? Because we understand that no matter how we tell people, like, people will read us one way or another, and we want to correct that.
Yeah, and I don't think we can, eliminate, because I've thought about this before too, when it comes to like, okay, if we, say that being a woman looks like this and being a man looks like that, is that not enforcing the gender binary? That is kind of a critique that radical feminists tend to have of other feminists. But the thing is like, I think people don't realize is like, you cannot eliminate categories just by wishing it into existence or wishing like overnight that you're going to be treated a certain way just because you believe that that is correct. If I stopped conforming to my gender, there would be consequences, even if I, sorry, the phone is ringing. There would be consequences. Someone just doesn't
That's the
want me
cancel
to.
police coming for you, Mila.
Cancel police are coming for me.
They're gonna knock at your door. No.
Well, you are in Canada. No.
Well, I just think it just expects a lot of trans people, let's say, or anyone really, when you say, okay, well, if you like, you don't have to like, being a woman doesn't have to mean looking this way or wearing a dress. So why are you reinforcing it? And yeah, that might be true, but you can't change that social perception overnight, and you can't change the ways that these, even if it is a social construction, it's very real in the social imagination, and so you can't. I had an analogy and it just like escaped me because like the cancel police came calling, but I think.
Well, I mean, I wonder, and as a lead in Esperanza for you, perhaps. I mean, the fact that we here we are having a sort of an interesting academic discussion of some issues that are sort of interesting, right? And but also just thinking about the strength of feeling and why, just in discourse terms, right? It's considered a risky topic, and people, weird reactionaries have built entire careers on essentially just like pushing this button over and over again, and it can inflame passions like few other subjects that we would regularly discuss in the commons, as it were.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think on one hand too, like the left, especially the trans left, just needs to stop caring about people's opinions and attitudes, right? Like people are gonna feel a certain way. And much like, sort of like the black Marxist tradition says, is like, who cares what people's, what racist attitudes people have? Like, we don't want to change attitudes. We want to take power and make those attitudes irrelevant, right? And I think in a similar way, that's what our community needs to start doing, instead of getting caught up in these like endless and pointless culture wars. Especially because, you could just troll and just sort of take our attention weeks, months, years at a time on it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a huge obstacle just for the left in general is any bad view or opinion, whether like just like because of the way you see the world at that point, or mostly because at that point, like you're uneducated about certain topics, is people want to just cut ties with you versus maybe having some disagreements, but working for a broader goal, which is like working class power.
Well, certainly, if you are going to focus your attention somewhere, surely do it on the stuff that has material consequences on your life, not on the stuff that is about ideas, and ideas that are bad or wrong or offensive. But like, unfortunately, we kind of as a political left treat everything with equal and equivalent weight across all categories, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of like this is a point that I've made a lot, and that's we can't just you can't change politics by wagging your finger and being like, don't talk like that, or hey, you don't say that, like that's not a viable strategy. It's much better to expect that people are always going to have different opinions than you, and you need to structure society in ways that people who think lesser of you are not able to hold power over you. That's kind of what's relevant here. because there's just no feasible way. And I've said this to, both the left and to like anti-cancel culture centrists. Like, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to just say, hey, don't do that? Or are you going to change the structures in order to make the wielding of capricious power less likely?
Yeah. And, I think that is what we need to talk about more. And, right within the trans community, I don't think that there is who's a prominent voice in the community that has a real strategy on end violence against trans women. I think people are largely caught up in politics representation. You look at what's that one Netflix documentary? I think it's called Disclosure, and it's all about representation. Activists in the trans community want to be the sort of individual branded activist instead of, the organizer that's knocking doors in the background and building an army. And I think that we need to step away from these individualistic approaches, these politics of representation, the concern with being right and correct in our ideas, but not our strategy. And I think that, to do that, we need to abandon this postmodern trend and theories of gender and resistance, and instead start focusing on how we build ourselves up as a collective movement to have real power. But I'm not seeing that come from anyone right now.
Well, I wonder if the left is like afraid of seizing power because they're kind of scared of like these like post-Cold War authoritarianism accusations.
Power is fash.
Yeah, I think it does haunt the left, though. Like, they really want to try and move things through discourse instead. And, like, I think that we need to realize that no one's going to capitulate, or power relations aren't going to change through discourse, and that people who are on the margins have the right to fight back. And so, like, my favorite feminist quote is actually from Zizek, which is problematic AF. But I have it here. And he says, "Men who claim I support feminism, I am for women, but nonetheless, I feel sometimes brutally manipulated by women. Of course, they have the right to do it. That's the way for them to fight. What do you think? If you were a man, that we should oppress women, but they should be these nice angelic beings? They have the right to be brutal often, to fight back." And I think, like, when I heard him say that, it was so refreshing for two reasons. Because it, first of all, tackled this leftist myth that the oppressed are all angels, that everyone's just going to come to their senses and eventually just start treating them nicely. And second, that, like, you have to use the tools at your disposal to actually try and seize power. And I think the left is so afraid of that because they're more interested in looking like moral exemplars and not for actually long-term fighting for people's interests.
We're coming up on time. I'd love to keep going, but I want to check in with each of you how people find more of your content, or where do they send the hate mail? Esperanza?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at End Class Society. And, I'm trying to post, more regular things on Medium. And I'll be having some, more articles of writing come out soon in some different places as well, surrounding, gender, the sex trade, and also technology and the future of work. So would love for anyone to engage in it, critique it, anything.
Oh, wait, Mila? Where do people find you?
I recommend Esperanza's work. It's
amazing.
Hell yeah. I have to say that, like, the other day I was at the recording studio and this guy asked me about what I think about sex work, and I literally just sent Esperanza's article. I'm like, just read this before you talk to me. And so I also recommend everyone follow Esperanza. I'm on Twitter at SaidContra. I did have a podcast where actually dissolving ish,
Aw.
and we are starting a new pod. I'm starting a new podcast with some other people, which will be starting on Saturday with a very dynamic intro guest. So stay tuned for that. We'll be announcing the details of that later.
Fantastic. And you can see both Mila and Esperanza and some other friends on the next More Marxists Than You Can Handle live stream, which is
Right.
a thing that's coming up. That's soon, right?
Yeah, I think
The 19th?
I think it's supposed to be next Saturday.
I think it's next Saturday.
Unless anything changes.
We'll put it in the episode description. Anyway, thank you, Mila. Thank you, Esperanza, for being here.
Thank you.